We were talking yesterday about how there was, in some parts of the country, there was a real optimism around 1937, 1938. Were things getting better in 1937 where you were? Was that?
Well, in 37, I was in Portland, Oregon, and the effect of the Depression was a little late in arriving on the West Coast. But when I got there, I stayed there, and conditions were, I say, from bad to awful. Take your choice. And but there was a beginning of hope, especially because of the promise offered on the great river developments that President Roosevelt had undertaken back in 1935, and somewhat earlier, patterned after the Tennessee Valley Authority. But the Depression continued in the Northwest, I would say, until the advent of the war, about 1941. Then there was a great influx.
What did you see around you in 38 that told you that it was still bad, that people were still struggling? You described some things for me yesterday, I think, and your own situation as well.
Well, I came back to Oregon in 36 from the Tennessee Valley Authority, hoping to start a similar development in the Northwest, the Columbia Valley Authority. And in 1937, we actually started the power administration there. And I remember one of the first things I did was take the administrator down to a bridge just 3 or 4 blocks from our headquarters. And there was an encampment of perhaps 80 or 90 men with children and wives living in paper shacks, roasting potatoes over open fires or in empty barrels. But anything to keep out of the rain, because it rains 9 months a year in Portland.
What was the administrator's reaction?
He was slightly shocked. He had come from a sheltered life as head of the Public Utilities Commission in Illinois, and he wasn't used to, I guess, getting down to the hoi polloi in the areas of under bridges.
You had said something about that you were doing some writing menus or something. Can you tell me about that?
Well, when I came west again, back to Portland to take the bar exam, I was very much interested in bringing the public power movement to life in Oregon, which I had engaged in some years previously without much effect. And we started the People's Power League, and we ran a surgeon named Dr. Hosch for governor of the state on a public power program, and that really captured the imagination of people throughout the state. And I remember I had just completed a biography of Senator Norris, who was the father of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I was very much inspired to see if we can't do the same thing in Oregon and Washington, Idaho, and Montana. But they were hard times. I remember my luncheon often would consist of all the buttermilk you can drink for 5 cents at the buttermilk corner. But then I got a job typing menus for my lunch. The lunch cost 25 cents, and this went on for a month or so till the fellow who owned this little restaurant said, "I'm sorry, Steve, I'm going to start writing the menus by hand." So that was the end of my free meal. Oh, and there were lines of people getting sandwiches at the local churches. But people took it a lot better, I think, than one would expect. They felt that everybody else was sharing the misery, and they helped each other out. I remember my father had a friend across the street who was a contractor, but there was no building. So my father went and brought him a sack of beans and a side of bacon. And I'll never forget the thanks we got for that.
Yeah, that's great to have shared.
But there were all sorts of stories. When I was at college a little earlier in the Depression, I remember people had started a cooperative farm just out of Eugene, Oregon. Unfortunately, it had a high mortgage on it. And there were perhaps 20 people at this table eating bread with a white substance. And my roommate says, "What is that?" I said, "It's margarine." He said, "What's margarine?" I said, "Oh, Dick, your father has a fancy restaurant in Portland, so you've never seen it. But margarine is what most people eat who can't afford butter. And that shocked him and ultimately turned him from a very conservative person into a quite a liberal and emotional person. He went on to become United States Senator finally, and then we wrote this book together on Senator Norris. So it was a very interesting metamorphosis.
That's nice. What did the building of the dam represent at this time, when amidst all this hardship? What was the significance of the dam?
Well, I think mainly it represented hope for a lot of people because there wasn't much to be hopeful for before. The main industry throughout the states was the forest products industry. Sawmills and a few plywood plants that had started, but unemployment was rampant. Douglas fir for lumber was down to $11 a thousand board feet. Right now it's about $800, so you can see the difference in the price level of things. A loaf of bread was 5 cents. A can of Campbell's pork and beans was 5 cents. I remember when I was at college at Eugene, we'd subsist on day-old pies, so-called. They were about 4 days old. They were all sour, but for 15 cents you get a pie about 15 inches in diameter. And that would be not a treat, that would be a meal. I remember there were people right outside of the edge of town who would be compelled to saw through a whole log before they would be given a bowl of soup and a slab of bread by the Salvation Army, or whatever the relief agency was. Or we would buy cans of vegetables for 5 cents. Or I remember other school chums would raid the fields for winter vegetables like beets and potatoes and carrots. And one day I brought a can of corned beef around, and I was king for the day because they hadn't tasted meat in weeks. Although you could get room and board for $12 a month, not a week, but a month.
The food was hard to find.
So there were hard times throughout the state.
So something like the dam was represented a better future, or?
It represented hope not merely for an immediate job, although that was very important because they were paying skilled carpenters 50 cents an hour, and they have to drive 42 miles from Portland to the dam and to the dam site and back. But it represented the prospect of electrifying the whole Northwest and providing pumps for the farms so they could pump the water during the dry period. July and August are dry months, especially in the Willamette Valley. And there was the hope of bringing industry there to replace the single forestry industry that permeated the state. And they were quite successful in that respect. When the dam was completed and the fresh power was generated, they signed contracts with the Aluminum Company of America, with Olin Chemical, and half a dozen other plants to use this cheapest power in America. It was it was sold for less than a third of a cent a kilowatt hour. Now it's up around 8, 9, 10 cents a kilowatt hour, so you can see. And that attracted the aluminum industry and the chemical industries. And of course, the great bonus was when they found that they had a source of aluminum for airplanes when the war broke out in 1941.
So this new thing, electricity, was really going to be the big savior for the economy in Pacific Northwest.
That's right. You see, there was no coal or oil in Oregon or Washington, or very little in Idaho. And the only fuel we had pretty much was either imported oil for the rich people up on the hill, or in our case, the family had the slabs that came off Douglas fir logs that were squared off, and the good part of the log shipped to Japan called Jap squares. And then we replaced it with sawdust finally. We thought we were doing well. But when I got back from the Army, my wife got tired of shoveling sawdust, so we joined people all throughout the area in electrifying and having electric heat in the homes. And that became the great convenience, and quite an industry developed as a result.
Sort of the energy source of the future, I guess, when it was first introduced, huh?
Yes, it did. And people who had been quite conservative realized that the development of this great river system for water and for power and for navigation and for flood control could contribute to their lives in a variety of ways. But I think it was the inspiration of TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, that imbued it with the idea that they could duplicate the same thing in the Northwest.
There was do you remember anything very specific about the economic downturn in 37 and 38, this Roosevelt recession? There were some WPA cuts that sent the economy spiraling. Did you experience any?
Well, in 37, I remember my situation wasn't very good. Our 95% of the lawyers in Portland were on relief, on WPA or some other type of relief. And I'd do odd jobs after I finished writing this book for different lawyers, writing briefs. But I remember I went out to foreclose a number of gasoline tanks at a service station. And I tried to appear young, tough, but the fellow smiled and said, "Sonny, you want those tanks? Go take them." I didn't take them. But after that, I went to work for the government, and I said, "We got to do something about this." And I think we did.
Hold on a second. We're out.
Marker.
So you were telling me about the hardships that were still persisting in 37 for you, and it was difficult for lawyers and what that meant.
That's right. And when I had a chance to go to work for the government, well, let me say, preceding that, I had spent a great deal of time organizing this People's Power League, and there was a great division of opinion as to what should be done with the power from all these dams, whether it should be concentrated at the dam for the benefit of some large corporations, or whether the transmission lines should be built throughout the area to bring the power to the valleys and mountains and other states that surrounded the Columbia River. And of course, the People's Power League was endeavoring to spread the power benefits as widely as possible, just as they had done in the 7 states in the Tennessee Valley. And we had Dr. Hosh ran for governor on that program, but he dropped out. But they succeeded in defeating the very conservative government, who was pretty much tied up with the private interests. So Franklin D. Roosevelt at that time, 1937, appointed a man whom we all supported, who was J.D. Ross, who had been superintendent of the Seattle City Light System, and who incidentally was a personal friend of FDR. And he was determined to spread the benefits of power throughout not only the immediate area and the states nearby, but he had visions of long-distance transmission of electricity that would benefit the entire nation, particularly direct current transmission, which was unheard of. All transmission in those days was alternating current, AC. And he was going to build 500,000 volt lines that would reach down to California and across Idaho and to the other states. And he finally did that over the years. They thought he was a dreamer, but he was quite practical, and yet he was a dreamer at the same time. He dreamed of the people having heat pumps in their backyard where the heat would be extracted from the earth. And they would heat their homes with these heat pumps, and that has developed too. So it was quite inspiring to work for a man of that type. And I suggested we even make a film about this, as Pere Lorentz had done with the Tennessee Valley. And he said, "Yes, Steve, we ought to do that, but I'd like to make the film." And he would carry this old Kodak camera around, especially when he went to see the president, to take pictures of his family. So it wasn't until after he left that we finally started making a film or two ourselves.
Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the war, which was also mounting overseas at this time. And do you remember when you began to feel that it might be inevitable that the United States would get involved in the turmoil abroad?
I remember very well, because we were making our first film called Hydro, and about the benefits of integrated development of a great river system. And just at that time, in May of 1940, I recall, the German Panzer divisions broke through the Maginot Line in France. And for the first time, America started to wake up to realize that they had to face dictatorships, not only in Germany, but in Italy and in Japan, that might threaten to take over the rest of the world, and would we be next? And so that alarmed President Roosevelt, so he started a program of trying to help the Allies, although there was a great deal of isolationist sentiment in this country, especially in the Middle West. And so we once turned our attention to what could be done to speed up the development of industries that were essential to our survival. For instance, the production of aluminum became concentrated in the Northwest because of the cheap electricity which was available in large quantities. Also, the construction of ships. They required a tremendous number of ships to move all the men and materials overseas, especially since the German U-boats were sinking English and other ships almost every day. And the first year of the war was a very gloomy one for a lot of people because we were not doing very well. But we were building the sinews of strength to ultimately achieve the victories that we finally got.
Talk to me a little bit about your personal feelings about what was going on abroad and what you felt the U.S. responsibility was.
Well, I had been aware of the German situation for a long time. Senator Neuberger, when he was at college with me, he went to Germany and he saw what was going on. And he came back quite a liberal, and we wrote an article from the Republic together about the dangers of the rising fascism in Germany. It had risen already, as a matter of fact. This was in '34. And but for most of America, they were still asleep. There was very little in the way of armaments, and the Army was mainly a way of employing the unemployed. I remember during the depth of the Depression, I was approached by a recruiting officer, and he said, "You enlist in the Army, you get 3 square meals a day, and you can see the world." I said, "I don't want to see the world, and I don't need the Army food. I hear it's awful." But that was the nature of the Army in those days, and of armament. And it wasn't, as I said, until 1940 that America really woke up. And I remember I was a member of a group called the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. We had to counterbalance the isolationist sentiment that was still prevalent during that period in the Middle West. It was something like the First World War. I recall my research for this biography of Senator Norris. There was a lot of opposition to World War I with much less reason. And
why were you so active on this committee? I mean, what did you feel was at stake? Why was it so important at that point?
Well, because England was being besieged, and it was the last hope for saving the continent. Norway had been invaded. Denmark had been taken over. The lowlands had been overrun. And the Germans were down in Africa by that time, and over in Greece. And it was quite evident that, at least in my judgment, that we were facing a dictator who was really mentally unstable, and that you could not depend upon him to keep his agreements, as indicated by the way he broke his truce, not truce, but his agreement with Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess, as it was called in those days. And in Japan, the tide was rising too. We were on the Pacific coast. We felt quite vulnerable to Japan. In fact, right after the war, after Pearl Harbor, a few months later, Oregon was shelled in 2 places, although we weren't told about it until after the war. One at Astoria and one down at Brookings on the coast.
Tell me about Pearl Harbor. Where were you when you heard the news, and what did you do?
I was riding up to the Columbia River toward the dam at about 11:30, and they broke into the symphony announcement that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, or at least I had never heard of it before. I'd never been in Hawaii. But that night, we mobilized our staff, and we all went out with shotguns and rifles, and anybody who happened to have an old pistol, to guard the transmission line crossings, because we were afraid the Japanese would try to blow them up to disrupt the transmission of power to the aluminum companies and the chemical companies that were vital to our war effort.
What happened to the economy of the Pacific Northwest after?
Well, it really almost miraculously boomed. 16-year-old girls were, for the first time in their lives, given jobs. Even I went to work in the shipyards at night after a full day at the office. And I would work from 8 in the evening until 4 in the morning, as I recall, at the shipyards in Portland. And there were 16-year-old girls welding steel sheets and pulling cables, and everybody pitched in. I also made 87 cents an hour, as I recall, for my night labor. But Henry Kaiser, who had been one of the builders of Grand Coulee and Bonneville Dam, recruited people from all over the country, from the South, from the ghettos of New York, and brought trainloads of people to work in the shipyards. And we finally built ships in 30 days, and finally we were able to complete a ship in 10 days. Of course, all they would do was assembling the ship would be subcontracted out. And I figured if we could do that in those days, why can't we do that now to revive our economy and to utilize the talents that we have and the willingness of people, because when they get together and have a cause to work for, they'll do it.
Yeah, it was such a tremendous achievement, that war effort. Everyone talks about it. Yeah? Okay, why don't we just change now? I want to shift gears back a little bit again to, you went to the San Francisco World's Fair in 1940. I wonder if you can describe that a little bit for me. Tell me what you were most impressed with there.
Well, I had come down from Oregon to San Francisco to look over primarily to start a film on the subject of the Columbia River. And we went across to Treasure Island, where this magnificent fair was going on, and it offered quite a contrast with what was happening right outside of it, say on the streets of San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York or even Portland, Oregon. They, of course, had tried to hype things up and cheer up people and make them believe that a new era had arisen. And I remember the Pacific Gas and Electric Company was especially vigorous in that field. Being interested in the power question, I naturally gravitated toward their particular booths. But I was more interested in what was happening in the valleys rather than the cities, because that's where the migrant problem had come into play. Hordes of migrants had come in from Oklahoma and Arkansas and Mississippi, hoping to get jobs picking the crops, because they'd been tractored out, as Steinbeck had pointed out in The Grapes of Wrath, which, by the way, inspired me to see if we couldn't do something to help with that problem. And I visited one of the first labor camps there at Bakersfield, and I heard some stories that really curled my hair about the mistreatment of the migrant workers and the very low wages they were paid, and the bad health conditions of the children and little children working in the fields. And I remember Bob Flaherty, the famous documentary film man, told me of a scene he had shot the day before. He says, it was a girl in her sleep, about 7 years old, and she was moving her hands like this. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, she's dreaming she's picking peas. And they had 7-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 5-year-olds working in the fields because a family couldn't exist on the labor of one man. And then these people, I had seen them come up to Oregon, too, to pick hops in the Willamette Valley and to pick apples in Hood River and Wenatchee and Yakima and places like that. They all came west with the hope that this would mean a new life for them. Because the West, I guess since the days of the 49ers, the miners, it was the old golden sunset and the opportunity that might present itself that they could never have at home. And maybe it will happen yet, because a lot of things start on the West Coast, and like the winds and the clouds move east to the Atlantic and spread the word. Even our local congressman has become head of the Office of Management and Budget, and I think he's going to stir things up. That's Leon Panetta. He believes that you don't have to throw money at problems, but there are things that you can do to solve the problems and still maintain a sound economy.
It's interesting you were talking about the promise. It seems like the whole end of the decade there was this idea of there being a promise for the future, and it was never quite realized until the war came.
That's pretty much the case, but you see, we didn't have much of an opportunity because although there was a tremendous amount of power on the Columbia River, the greatest power stream on the continent, if not the whole hemisphere, the transmission lines had not yet been built very far. The industries had just started developing, and these were the primary industries and not the secondary ones that utilized the aluminum and the chemicals and the plastics. And right now, I think we're facing a similar era in the Silicon Valley. I think here in California and down in Southern California and up in Oregon, right at Vancouver, Portland, Corvallis, there are large technological developments, especially in the computer field and the software field. And I think that offers great promise, and I think those things will spread east as the months go ahead if we have the collaboration between government and industry and the academia and labor. In other words, we have to work together on it.
Well, I was just about to ask you some sort of summary thoughts about the decade, and I wonder if one of the things that came out of that era was a different kind of role that government played, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I raised that question with my economics professor, Donald Erb, a brilliant fellow at Eugene, who later became president of the university after a stay at Stanford. And he says, industry cannot exist in modern society apart from government. And the same is true with labor and with education. They all have to work together. And while he didn't express these things in the classroom, he did tell us in bull sessions in the evening when we'd go around and say, what can be done to meet the situation? And
was that something that came out more in the 30s?
Yes, because the great promise, there was immediate relief in providing jobs for the unemployed with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. In every field, there were projects for writers and projects for artists. There were sweeping the streets, raking leaves, as they called it, but it was much more than that. And people went to work for 25 or 30 cents an hour, but that was a lot of money in those days. When I was at school, I was even on a project like that, revising the criminal code for 25 cents an hour. But the problem was I could only work 40 hours a month, and that was only $10, but you could live on $10. So they provided immediate hope, and at the same time they built these structures, diverted rivers and built dams and irrigated thousands of acres to provide for looking ahead to the future. And I think that's what we have to do now. We have to solve our immediate short-term problems and look ahead to the long-term structural problems that we must correct.
How do you think living through those years of hardship, economic hardship, changed you or changed your outlook?
Well, it fortified my view. What Donald Erb told me, that people have to work together, and the government has to work not in an adversarial position with either labor or industry, but we have great potential. We have an enormous country with a background that's made it the #1 nation in the world, the hope of the peoples of Europe and of Asia. And they came here to get the opportunity for a better life for themselves and especially their children. And I became convinced that the government has a role and that we should not belittle it, and we should examine carefully what it does to see that the funds are not wasted. There are ways to employ the talents we have in this country and the resources we have to correct all the problems that we failed to meet beforehand, and end the eras of speculation and have some honest financing whether it's in the banks or in the public sector or the private sector. There's hope in America. And I think that I'm encouraged very much by a new spirit which seems to be taking hold here in almost Christmas Eve 1992.
Is that for a second?
Okay.
So can you tell me that story again about what you did when the administrator came?
Well, in March of 1939, just after our administrator, James D. Ross, had died, and all his plans were up in the air, his great visions of the future, we had a new administrator come out from Illinois to run the whole power program. And Ivan Block and I, he was the economist in the outfit, were determined to figure out what we could do to inspire him to help solve some of the pressing problems that confronted the people of the entire Northwest, and perhaps set a pattern for the rest of the nation, just like TVA had done back in the early days. And to impress him with how bad the situation was, we said, just 3 blocks away from here, we can give you an example. So he reluctantly got on his raincoat. It was always raining in Portland at that time of the year, March. And we walked down Grand Avenue to the big bridge that went over Sullivan's Gulch. And there, looked down, we could see a whole beehive of people, children, women, men, huddled under the bridge to keep out of the rain. They had built little tar paper shacks there. And they were cooking their potatoes or what have you over open fires or in tin cans. And I said, this is just one illustration that is close to our headquarters, but the forest industry which prevails throughout this area is in bad shape. The price of lumber is down to as low as $11. That's unheard of. And the mills are closed. I said, I used to have a job at 25 cents an hour helping a night watchman when I was at college, and that was 4 years ago. And
so these people were living just down the street from your office?
That's right. And the contrast was, and right above the bridge was Sears Roebuck, the big store where you could spend your money if you had any. And the stores were pretty empty in those days. So that there was something we had to do to inspire the people to believe that they more than just had a public utility operation to do. They had to relate this whole construction program, development program, to solving some of these pressing problems. Mm-hmm. We had to justify the expenditures that were being made by the federal government, because the state government couldn't do it, the cities couldn't do it, and the communities could help each other. They took in each other's washing, but they couldn't help provide the meat on the table or the bread for the kids.
We've rolled out. Can you tell me again about your visit to the fair and what you were most impressed and struck by going to?
Well, in the spring of 1940, I left Portland to go down to California. I had just read and reread Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, and I wanted to see for myself how bad conditions were. I had heard about it during the earlier years of the Epic Plan when they were having the elections in California. I was up in college in those days. And I wanted to see if they had actually changed much, whether conditions were still bad, or whether it was just a fanciful thing that Steinbeck had written about. But it was there. And the great contrast was between the magnificent city of San Francisco and the new bridges they were building, and the World's Fair that was being held on Treasure Island, when they predicted a rosy future. And there were thousands of people that had come from all over the country to see what the West could offer again. They had dreams of Days of 49 or the World's Fair of 1914 in San Francisco. It was the hope that it would be a new era. That was in 39 the fair started. But then, in 40, I looked and the conditions were still bad. And it wasn't until the Germans actually crossed the Maginot Line and were threatening Paris and finally taking it that America started to wake up that there was a threat that faced not only England and the rest of the continent, whatever was left of it, but the entire world, because we were suspicious of Japan at that time. They had a military dictatorship. Italy had a military dictatorship. And so my viewpoint changed somewhat as to what we ought to do with our great federal projects. And it became evident that we had to develop the industries in the Northwest to provide the sinews of war and also opportunities for employment in the peace that was to follow. Because you can't be strong in one field unless you're strong in the other. You can't be strong in the military and have a weak economy, and vice versa. Or strong in the health of your people and the education of your people. But there were immediate problems in those days, and I said perhaps we can inspire some of our people to realize them and show this as a shining example, just like I learned back at GVA 2 or 3 years previously. Maybe I was just a incredible idealist, but there was a determination and a opportunity to do something, and I said, let's go for it.
Was there a real greater idealism, do you think, for a brief period in the 30s? Was there a great idealism?
Yes, we hadn't been subjected to the go-go era of the 80s. There had been speculation in the 20s, but most people had not been directly concerned with it. But in the 80s, we had led to have greater expectations. We had television, for one thing, that showed all the goodies that people could have. 2 cars in every garage. In those days, it was only a car in every garage. But unfortunately, in this era, we have problems that didn't exist at that time. We have more problems of education, health problems, AIDS epidemics, loss of our manufacturing industries. All these factors didn't exist in those days. We were at the end of a business cycle back in the 30s, or beginning of the 30s, but now we're more than at the end of a business cycle. We're at the end of a period when structural adjustment is obviously necessary, and our government has to work with our people. We cannot continue to have an adversarial relationship of business and labor, government and academia. But I'm confident that if we all work together, that if they cooperate, the spirit that has made us indomitable will rise again. And I think of those pioneers who crossed the plains and went across the mountains and came down to San Francisco. And this was all reflected in the World's Fair that day, and it gave us a glint of the future and inspired us to see what we could do to make it come back.
Thank you. I think that's fine. Yeah. I'm glad you ended on an up note.